The fluorescent lights of Nordstrom cast harsh shadows across my mother's face as she raised her voice for everyone to hear. Look at her. She can't even pay for her own clothes. The words cut through the afternoon shopping buzz like a blade through silk. Margaret Williams, my mother, stood there in her designer knockoff blazer, pointing at me with the same manicured finger she'd used to discipline me my entire 19 years of life. The other shoppers paused their conversations, their eyes darting between us like spectators at a tennis match. My face burned with the familiar heat of public humiliation. The Burberry dress I'd chosen, a modest piece really, considering my means, suddenly felt like evidence of some terrible crime. The cashier, a young woman probably my age with kind eyes, looked uncomfortable as she held the price tag, waiting for resolution to this domestic drama unfolding at her register. "Mom, please," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the store's ambient music. But Margaret wasn't finished with her performance. 19 years old and still expecting handouts, she continued, her voice carrying that particular brand of maternal disappointment that could make grown men shrink. When I was her age, I worked 2 jobs just to buy groceries. The lie stung more than the public shaming. Margaret had never worked 2 jobs in her life. She'd married my father at 22, moved into his family's estate, and had spent the last 2 decades perfecting the art of spending other people's money. But the strangers around us didn't know that. They saw what she wanted them to see, a frustrated mother dealing with an entitled daughter. I reached into my purse with trembling fingers, past the lip gloss and phone, to the black card nestled in its leather holder. The Chase Palladium felt heavier than usual as I pulled it out, the weight of secrets pressing down on my shoulders. Margaret's eyes narrowed as she saw it. This wasn't part of her script. "Where did you get that?" she hissed. But I was already handing it to the cashier. The machine beeped once, then twice. Then came the sound that changed everything. A long, clear tone that meant approval. But it wasn't just approval for the dress. The screen displayed my available credit limit, and in that moment, the carefully constructed narrative of my life began to crumble. The cashier's eyes widened as she read the numbers. A woman standing behind us in line gasped audibly. Margaret's face went from flushed anger to pale shock in the span of a heartbeat. The credit limit staring back at us wasn't hundreds or even thousands. It was 7 figures. "There must be some mistake," Margaret said, but her voice had lost its commanding edge. She sounded smaller suddenly, uncertain. The cashier looked from the screen to me, then back to the screen. "No mistake, ma'am. The transaction went through perfectly." She handed me back the card with newfound respect, her demeanor shifting entirely. "Would you like this in a bag, Miss Williams?" The silence stretched like taffy, thick and uncomfortable. Other shoppers had stopped pretending not to listen. A man in an expensive suit pulled out his phone, probably Googling my name. A teenager whispered to her friend, pointing not at my mother now, but at me. Margaret reached for my arm, her grip tight enough to leave marks. "Annabelle, we need to talk. Now." But I was done talking, done explaining, done pretending to be the person she needed me to be to maintain her version of reality. I took the shopping bag from the cashier and turned to face my mother, this woman who had raised me with one hand while keeping devastating secrets with the other. "No, Mom," I said, my voice steady for the first time in years. "You need to listen." The drive home from the mall was suffocating. Margaret gripped the steering wheel of her leased BMW with white knuckles, her silence more terrifying than her earlier outburst. I stared out the passenger window, watching suburban Seattle blur past in a streak of gray sky and evergreen trees. The Nordstrom bag sat between us like evidence of a crime neither of us was ready to discuss. Our house, Margaret's house, really, sat at the end of a cul-de-sac in Bellevue, all manicured lawns and architectural pretension. From the outside, it screamed success. 3-car garage, professionally landscaped garden, the kind of address that impressed dinner party guests. But I knew the truth about the second mortgage, the maxed-out credit cards hidden in her desk drawer, the constant juggling act of bills and appearances. "Inside," Margaret said as we pulled into the driveway. "Now." I followed her through the front door, past the family photos that told the story she preferred. Margaret and my father David at charity galas, their wedding picture with her in vintage Vera Wang, images of family vacations to places we could barely afford, but attended anyway, because appearances mattered more than financial stability. Margaret disappeared into the kitchen, and I heard the familiar clink of ice against glass. Day drinking had become more frequent since my 18th birthday, though she called it managing stress. I settled into the living room, sinking into the white leather sofa that had cost more than most people's cars. She returned with a vodka tonic that was mostly vodka, her earlier composure cracking at the edges. Where did that card come from, Annabelle? The question I'd been dreading for months. The question that would unravel everything. It's mine, I said simply. Don't be ridiculous. You work part-time at that bookstore. You make what, $10 an hour? Her laugh was bitter, desperate. There's no way you have access to that kind of credit. She was right about the bookstore. I did work there, 20 hours a week, mostly because I loved being surrounded by stories, and the owner, Mrs. Chen, reminded me of the grandmother I'd never had. But the bookstore wasn't my real source of income, and it never had been. I have other investments, I said carefully. Margaret's eyes flashed. What investments? You're 19, Annabelle. You don't know anything about investments. The irony was suffocating. Here was a woman who had burned through my father's life insurance, sold his vintage car collection, and remortgaged our house twice, lecturing me about financial responsibility. But I couldn't tell her the truth. Not yet. Not when I was still figuring out what the truth even meant. My phone buzzed against my leg. A text message from the one person who knew my secret. Asterisk. How did it go at the mall? Jake asterisk. Jake Morrison had been my best friend since middle school, back when we were both awkward kids more interested in books than social hierarchies. He was also the only person who knew about the monthly deposits that had been appearing in my account since my 18th birthday. Large deposits. Life-changing deposits. Deposits that came with no explanation, no contact information, nothing but a reference number that led to a law firm in downtown Seattle. Who's texting you? Margaret demanded, trying to read my phone over my shoulder. Just Jake. That boy has been filling your head with ideas, college applications, scholarship nonsense. You don't need college, Annabelle. You have everything you need right here. But we both knew that was a lie. What I had here was a mother who saw me as an extension of herself, a supporting character in her ongoing performance as the grieving widow who'd maintained her dignity despite tragedy. What I had here was a woman who loved the idea of me more than the reality of who I was becoming. My father had died in a car accident when I was 16. One moment he was kissing me goodbye as I left for school, promising to help me with my calculus homework later. The next, he was gone, leaving behind a life insurance policy that should have secured our future, and a wife who spent it like it was burning holes in her pockets. The money is mine, Mom, I repeated, standing up. Legally, ethically, completely mine. Margaret's drink trembled in her hand. That's impossible. Is it? I met her eyes, seeing my own green irises reflected back at me. Or is it just impossible for you to accept that I might know things you don't? For a moment, something flickered across her face. Fear, maybe? Or recognition, like she was seeing me clearly for the first time in years. Then the moment passed, and the familiar mask of maternal authority slipped back into place. Go to your room, she said. We'll discuss this later when you're ready to tell me the truth. But as I climbed the stairs to my bedroom, I wondered if she would be able to handle the truth when it finally came, because the deposits weren't the only secret I'd been keeping. They weren't even the biggest one. My bedroom was the only space in the house that felt authentically mine. While Margaret favored cream walls and generic art, I'd painted mine deep navy and covered them with vintage movie posters and photographs I'd taken around the city. My desk sat by the window, 3 monitors arranged in a configuration that would make any tech enthusiast weep with envy. I locked the door and settled into my chair, the familiar hum of processors starting up like a mechanical lullaby. This was where the real magic happened. This was where Annabelle Williams became someone else entirely. At 14, while other kids were discovering social media and dating, I'd discovered cryptocurrency. Not the gambling, get-rich-quick schemes that dominated headlines, but the underlying technology. Blockchain fascinated me in a way that traditional subjects never had. While Margaret was busy spending Dad's money on keeping up appearances, I was learning to code, to analyze market patterns, to understand systems that most adults couldn't even pronounce correctly. My first investment had been $50 from my birthday money. Bitcoin was trading at $800 then, and everyone called it a fad. I bought a fraction of a coin and watched it like a hawk, learning from every fluctuation. By the time I turned 16, that $50 had become $5,000. By 17, $50,000. But cryptocurrency was just the beginning. I pulled up my portfolio dashboard. The number's still surreal after all this time. $7,432,816, and growing. It started with crypto, but I'd diversified quickly. Tech stocks, carefully chosen after analyzing company fundamentals and market positioning. International markets where I'd spotted opportunities before major firms caught on. A small investment in a startup that had seemed risky until they were acquired by Google for a sum that made headlines. The monthly deposits Margaret couldn't explain. Those came from the trust I'd discovered 6 months ago. A trust established in my name. Funding unknown, managed by Fletcher, Hartwell and Associates downtown. Every attempt to get more information hit a wall of legal jargon and professional courtesy. All I knew was that every month on the 15th, exactly $50,000 appeared in my account. No questions asked. My phone buzzed again. Jake, as persistent as always. Asterisk. Seriously? How bad was it? I typed back. Asterisk. She knows about the money now. Asterisk. All of it? Asterisk. Just the credit limit. She freaked. Asterisk, asterisk. Are you going to tell her? That was the question, wasn't it? How do you explain to your mother that while she's been struggling to maintain a lifestyle built on borrowed money and dead husband's insurance payouts, her teenage daughter has become independently wealthy? How do you explain that the girl she sees as dependent and naive has been making financial decisions that would impress Wall Street analysts? Asterisk, I don't know. It's complicated. Everything's complicated with Margaret. You know that. Jake was right. Margaret lived in a world where everything had to fit into neat categories: appropriate and inappropriate, respectable and embarrassing, successful and failing. There was no category for 19-year-old daughter has mysteriously become a millionaire. I opened another window and checked my latest trades. Tesla was up 3% since morning, just as I'd predicted based on their quarterly projections. The biotech stock I'd been watching finally showed movement after FDA approval came through ahead of schedule. Every decision I made was researched, calculated, strategic. This wasn't luck or trust fund privilege. This was work. But how could I explain that to a mother who still saw me as the little girl who needed help tying her shoes? A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. Annabelle? Margaret's voice was quieter now, the aggressive edge from earlier replaced by something that sounded almost vulnerable. I minimized my screens quickly. Come in. She pushed the door open, holding 2 cups of tea. Peace offering, maybe, or interrogation fuel. With Margaret, it was always hard to tell. I brought you chamomile, she said, setting 1 cup on my desk. Your favorite. Thanks. She perched on the edge of my bed, looking around the room like she was seeing it for the first time. When did you get so many computers? They're not all computers, Mom. 2 are monitors. For what? The honest answer would have ended the conversation before it started. For day trading. For analyzing market trends across 6 different time zones. For managing an investment portfolio that's worth more than this house. School projects, I said instead. Research. Margaret nodded, but her expression suggested she didn't quite believe me. Annabelle, I need you to understand something. After your father died, things got difficult. Financially difficult. I've been trying to protect you from that, but maybe I haven't done a good enough job explaining how tight things are. The confession hung between us, heavier than she probably realized, because I did know how tight things were. I'd been watching her struggle for 3 years, wanting to help, but knowing she'd never accept it. How do you offer to pay your mother's mortgage when she still sees you as a child? I know, Mom. So you understand why that card, whatever that was, it doesn't make sense, and it scares me. She looked smaller in that moment, more fragile than the commanding woman who'd humiliated me at the mall. This was the mother I remembered from right after Dad died, lost and overwhelmed and trying so hard to hold everything together. What if I told you it was legitimate? I asked carefully. What if I told you I could help with the financial problems? Margaret's expression hardened immediately. I would tell you that's impossible, and I'd want to know who's been taking advantage of you. There it was, the fundamental problem between us. She couldn't conceive of a world where I was capable of taking care of myself, let alone taking care of her. In her mind, any financial success I might have had to come from someone else's manipulation or generosity. What if you're wrong? I asked. I'm not wrong, Annabelle. I'm your mother. I know you better than anyone. But as I looked at her sitting on my bed, surrounded by the evidence of a life she'd never bothered to really examine, I realized the truth was much more complicated than either of us wanted to admit. She didn't know me at all. The next morning, I woke to the sound of Margaret on the phone downstairs, her voice carrying the particular tone she used when trying to sound more important than she felt. I checked my phone. 7:47 a.m., 3 missed calls from Jake, and a notification from my banking app that made my stomach clench. Asterisk unusual account activity detected. Please review recent transactions. I pulled up the app, scanning through yesterday's activity. Everything looked normal until I reached the bottom of the list. There, timestamped at 3:17 a.m., was a withdrawal I hadn't made. $1,500, taken from the checking account I'd foolishly linked to one of the cards in my wallet. My wallet that I'd left downstairs in my purse. I threw on jeans and a sweatshirt, taking the stairs 2 at a time. Margaret was in the kitchen, still on the phone, dressed in what I'd come to recognize as her important business outfit, a burgundy blazer that made her look like a real estate agent trying too hard to close a deal. Yes, I understand the minimum payment was due yesterday, she was saying, her back to me as she paced between the counter and the window. But surely we can work something out. I've been a loyal customer for 8 years. Credit card company. Had to be. The conversation had all the hallmarks of Margaret's monthly dance with debt, equal parts desperation and manufactured indignation. My purse sat on the counter where I'd left it, but something was wrong. The zipper was closed, but not quite the way I always left it. I checked inside. Everything was there except for one thing, the backup debit card for my main checking account. Mom, I said quietly, not wanting to interrupt her call but needing answers. She held up a finger, still talking. No, I can't do $700, but I can do $300 by Friday, and the rest the following week. I waited, watching her perform this familiar ritual of financial juggling. Margaret had always been good at making promises she couldn't keep, painting pictures of future stability that never quite materialized. After Dad died, it had gotten worse, much worse. Finally, she hung up and turned to me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Good morning, sweetheart. You're up early. Where's my debit card? The question hung in the air between us, heavy with implication. Margaret's smile flickered, just for a second, before reasserting itself with renewed brightness. I don't know what you mean. The card that was in my wallet. It's gone. Maybe you left it somewhere? You know how forgetful you can be. But I wasn't forgetful, and we both knew it. I'd inherited my father's methodical nature, the same trait that had made him successful in his engineering career. Every card had its place. Every receipt was saved. Every transaction was tracked. I checked my account, Mom. Someone withdrew $1,500 at 3 a.m. Margaret's composure cracked, just slightly. She turned away, busying herself with wiping down counters that were already clean. That's strange. You should call the bank. Report it stolen. Should I? Or should I ask you to give me back my card? The accusation landed like a physical blow. Margaret stopped moving, her hand frozen on the granite countertop that she'd insisted on when money was easier to come by. How dare you? She whispered. How dare I what? Ask where my money went. Wonder why my own mother is stealing from me. She whirled around, and for a moment I saw something in her eyes I'd never seen before. Not anger, not disappointment, but fear. Raw, desperate fear. I am not stealing from you. I borrowed money that you clearly don't need. Money that shouldn't exist in the first place. Borrowed implies you asked permission. I'm your mother, Annabelle. Everything you have, I gave you. This house, your education, your clothes, your food, everything. The argument was as old as it was flawed, but it carried the weight of 18 years of guilt and obligation. Margaret had always been masterful at rewriting history to cast herself as the perpetual victim, the selfless mother who sacrificed everything for her ungrateful daughter. That's not how money works, Mom. That's not how anything works. Then explain it to me, she said, her voice rising. Explain how my 19-year-old daughter has access to millions of dollars. Explain where it came from, who's controlling it, what they want in return. Because I know it's not legitimate, Annabelle. People our age don't just stumble into that kind of wealth. Our age. The phrase revealed more than she probably intended. At 43, Margaret still saw herself as young, as someone who should be hitting her financial prime instead of scrambling to keep creditors at bay. My success wasn't just confusing to her, it was threatening. What if I told you I earned it? I'd say you're lying. What if I proved it? She laughed, but there was no humor in it. You can't prove something that isn't true. I pulled out my phone and opened my portfolio app, the one that tracked every investment, every gain, every strategic decision I'd made over the past 5 years. I held it out to her, watching as her eyes tried to make sense of the numbers. This is fake, she said immediately. Anyone can make fake screenshots. It's not fake, Mom. Yes, it is. Because if it weren't fake, that would mean... She trailed off, the implications too large for her to process. That would mean What? That would mean you've been lying to me for years. That would mean you've been sitting here, watching me struggle, watching me stress about money, watching me sacrifice my pride to keep us afloat, while you had millions of dollars just sitting in accounts I didn't even know existed. The accusation hit harder than I expected, because it was true. I had been watching her struggle. I'd offered to help dozens of times, but never directly, never by revealing the extent of my resources. I'd suggested she let me pay for groceries, help with utilities, contribute to household expenses. Every offer had been rejected with lectures about responsibility and independence. I tried to help, I said weakly. You tried to help by offering to chip in $20 for takeout, not by mentioning that you're apparently wealthier than anyone we've ever met. And she was right, and the rightness of it made my chest tight with guilt I hadn't fully acknowledged before. But how do you tell someone that their entire worldview is wrong? How do you reveal that while they've been defining themselves by their struggles, you've been quietly building an empire they can't even comprehend? I was scared, I admitted. I didn't know how to tell you, so you let me humiliate myself instead. The words hung between us, true and terrible. I had let her humiliate herself. Every desperate phone call to creditors, every time she'd had to choose between groceries and gas, every night she'd stayed up worrying about bills while I was upstairs growing my portfolio. I'd been complicit in her suffering through my silence. I'm sorry, I said, but the words felt inadequate. Margaret nodded, but her expression suggested that sorry wasn't going to be enough. Not this time. Keep your apology, she said. Just give me back my dignity. Tell me the truth about where that money came from. But that was the problem. The truth was something I didn't fully understand myself. That afternoon, I sat in the waiting room of Fletcher, Hartwell & Associates, surrounded by the kind of expensive neutrality that screamed old money lawyer office. Beige walls, leather furniture that probably cost more than most cars, and the faint scent of furniture polish mixed with decades of important conversations. I'd called that morning, demanding answers about the monthly deposits. The receptionist had been politely unhelpful until I mentioned my name. Suddenly, there was an appointment available at 2 p.m., and Mr. Fletcher himself would see me. Thomas Fletcher looked like Central Casting's idea of a trust fund lawyer. Silver hair, expensive suit, the kind of handshake that suggested he'd spent decades managing other people's money. His office overlooked Elliott Bay, and I wondered how many clients had sat in this same chair, learning secrets about their families that changed everything. Miss Williams, he said, settling behind his desk with the deliberate movements of someone who'd perfected the art of delivering life-changing news. I'm surprised it took you this long to come see me. I've been trying to get information for months. No one would tell me anything. Yes, well, there were specific instructions about that. The trust was designed to remain anonymous until you reached age 20 or made direct contact with our office, whichever came first. He opened a file folder that had my name written across the tab in neat handwriting. Inside were documents that looked both official and ancient, covered in the kind of legal language that turned simple concepts into incomprehensible poetry. The Elizabeth Williams Trust, he said, sliding a paper across the desk. Established 18 months ago, funded through a series of carefully structured investments and transfers. The monthly disbursements you've been receiving represent approximately 3% of the annual growth. Elizabeth Williams, my grandmother's name. The grandmother I'd never met because she died when my father was still a child. I don't understand, I said. My grandmother died 30 years ago. How could she establish a trust 18 months ago? Fletcher's smile was patient, practiced. She didn't. Someone established it in her honor, using her name as the foundation identifier. The actual funding came from a more contemporary source. What source? I'm afraid I can't disclose that information. The trust documents specify that the funding source is to remain confidential unless certain conditions are met. What conditions? Fletcher consulted his notes, though I suspected he already knew exactly what he was going to tell me. Marriage, the birth of children, reaching age 25, or the death of any immediate family member. The categories felt arbitrary and strange. Why marriage? Why 25 specifically? And the last condition sent a chill down my spine that I tried to ignore. So someone, somewhere has been giving me money for no reason. Not no reason, Miss Williams. Someone has been ensuring your financial security through a vehicle that protects both your interests and theirs. It's actually quite elegant, from a legal perspective. But it didn't feel elegant. It felt manipulative and strange and deeply unsettling. Someone had been watching my life closely enough to know exactly when I turned 18, exactly which bank accounts to use, exactly how to structure payments to avoid detection until now. "How much money are we talking about?" I asked. Fletcher consulted another document. "The current trust value is approximately $47 million. At the current distribution rate, assuming standard market returns, the monthly payments can continue indefinitely while still growing the principal." $47 million. The number was so large it felt abstract, like discussing the distance to Mars or the number of stars in the galaxy. Numbers that big didn't feel connected to real life, to real consequences. And I can't know who established it, not unless one of the specified conditions is met. I stared out the window at Elliott Bay, watching ferries cross the gray water like toys in a bathtub. Someone out there knew things about my life that I didn't know myself. Someone had been planning my future, managing my resources, making decisions about my financial security without my knowledge or consent. What if I don't want the money? Fletcher raised an eyebrow. That would be unusual. But possible. Theoretically, yes. The trust documents include provisions for refusal of benefits. However, I should mention that such refusal would trigger automatic distribution to the secondary beneficiary. Who's the secondary beneficiary? Margaret Williams. Your mother. The puzzle pieces began rearranging themselves in my mind, forming patterns I didn't like. Someone who knew my family well enough to structure a trust that would benefit my mother if I refused it. Someone who understood the financial dynamics of our household, who knew about Margaret's struggles and my growing independence. "Mr. Fletcher," I said carefully, "how long has this firm been representing my family?" "We've handled various matters for the Williams family for approximately 15 years. Your father was a client before his death. What kind of matters?" "Estate planning, primarily. Some business transactions. I handled his will after the accident." I remembered the reading of Dad's will, or rather, I remembered being excluded from it. Margaret had handled everything, claiming it was too complicated and emotionally difficult for me to be involved. I'd been 16 and grieving, so I'd trusted her judgment. Was there anything in my father's will about a trust for me? Fletcher's expression became very carefully neutral. "Miss Williams, I think you should discuss these questions with your mother." But his non-answer was an answer itself. There had been something that connected my father's death to this mysterious trust, something that Margaret either didn't know about or had deliberately kept from me. "Can I see my father's will?" "You'd need your mother's permission, as the executor of the estate. What if she refuses? Then you'd need to wait until you meet one of the conditions I mentioned earlier." I left Fletcher's office with more questions than answers, but one thing was becoming clear. The money that had been changing my life wasn't some random windfall or cryptocurrency luck. It was connected to my family, to my father's death, to secrets that had been carefully hidden for 3 years. And the person who held the key to those secrets was the same person who'd been stealing from my checking account while lecturing me about financial responsibility. Margaret. I found Margaret in the garage, surrounded by boxes I'd never seen before. Cardboard containers that looked like they'd been packed hastily, labeled in my father's handwriting with words like office files and personal David. Boxes that should have been gone through years ago, but had apparently been hidden away instead. She looked up when I walked in, her face flushed from the physical exertion of moving heavy containers. "You're back early. What are these?" "Just some of your father's things. I thought it was time to finally sort through them, but the timing felt suspicious. The day after our fight about money, the day after I'd questioned her about stealing from my account, she was suddenly ready to confront 3 years of avoided grief. I knelt beside one of the open boxes, rifling through manila folders and loose papers. Bank statements from accounts I'd never heard of. Insurance documents with policy numbers that didn't match anything I remembered. A folder marked trust documents that was conspicuously empty. "Mom, what happened to Dad's trust documents?" Margaret's movements stilled. "What trust documents?" "The ones that were supposed to be in this folder." She stood up, wiping dust from her hands with deliberate slowness. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do." I pulled out another folder, this one containing correspondence between my father and Fletcher, Hartwell and Associates. Letterhead I recognized from that afternoon, dated just weeks before the accident. You know exactly what I'm talking about. The evidence was scattered throughout the boxes like pieces of a puzzle that Margaret had been trying to keep me from assembling. Letters discussing provisions for Annabelle's future security. Bank statements showing transfers to something called the EW Foundation. Life insurance documents that listed beneficiaries I'd never heard of. Your father had a lot of business interests, Margaret said carefully. I couldn't keep track of all of them. These aren't business interests, Mom. These are documents about me, about money that was supposed to be mine. I found what I was looking for in a folder buried near the bottom of the box. A copy of the trust establishment documents, signed by my father just 2 weeks before he died. The Elizabeth Williams Trust, exactly as Fletcher had described it, but with details that the lawyer hadn't shared. The funding source wasn't anonymous at all. It was my father's life insurance policy, not the small policy that Margaret had used to keep us afloat after his death, but a second policy I'd never known existed. $2 million that had been invested and managed so carefully that it had grown into the $47 million fortune that Fletcher had described. He knew, I whispered, reading through the legal language that suddenly made perfect sense. Dad knew something was going to happen to him. Margaret sank onto an overturned box, her carefully constructed composure finally cracking. It wasn't like that. Then what was it like? He was paranoid. About the business, about money, about making sure you'd be taken care of. He'd started talking about setting up trusts and insurance policies, and all these complicated financial arrangements that I couldn't understand. So you ignored them? I tried to talk him out of them. We had enough insurance. We had savings. You were only 16, Annabelle. The idea that something might happen to him seemed ridiculous, but something had happened to him. A car accident on a rainy Tuesday morning, on a route he'd driven thousands of times before. No other vehicles involved, no mechanical failure, just a curve taken too fast, and a guardrail that couldn't stop 2 tons of steel and glass. The accident report, I said suddenly. Do you still have it? Margaret's face went pale. Why would you want to see that? Because I'm starting to wonder if it was really an accident. The accusation hung between us like a toxic cloud. Margaret stood up abruptly, knocking over the box she'd been sitting on and spilling more papers across the concrete floor. That's enough, she said. You're upset about the money. I understand that. But you don't get to turn your father's death into some kind of conspiracy theory just because you're angry with me. But I was already piecing together a timeline that made my stomach clench with dread. Dad establishes a secret trust 2 weeks before his death. He funds it with a life insurance policy that no one else knows about. He dies in an accident that leaves no witnesses and raises no official questions. And the money sits in legal limbo for 3 years before payments start arriving exactly when I turn 18. Who else knew about the trust? I asked. I don't know. Maybe his business partner, Richard. They worked together on a lot of financial planning. Richard. Uncle Richard. Though he wasn't actually related to us. Dad's business partner in the consulting firm they'd built from nothing. The man who'd been around for every major decision in our family for the past decade. The man who'd helped Margaret navigate the insurance claims after Dad died. The man who'd been conveniently absent from our lives since the money started running out. When's the last time you talked to Richard? Margaret's expression became guarded. I don't know. Months ago, maybe. What about when you were dealing with Dad's estate? He helped you then, right? He helped with some of the business aspects, yes. But there was something in her tone that didn't match the casual dismissal. Something that suggested Richard's involvement had been more significant than she was admitting. I gathered the scattered papers from the floor, organizing them chronologically. The pattern became clearer with each document I examined. Dad had been concerned about something in the weeks leading up to his death, not paranoid, as Margaret claimed, but systematically protective, like a man who knew he was in danger, but couldn't explain why. Mom, I need you to be honest with me. What happened between you and Richard after Dad died? The question hit its mark. Margaret's face flushed, and she looked away, focusing on a water stain on the garage wall like it held the secrets of the universe. Nothing happened. Something happened. I can see it in your face. She was quiet for so long. I thought she might not answer at all. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. He offered to help manage the insurance money, said David would have wanted him to make sure we were taken care of. And I let him. God help me. I let him invest it, manage it, make decisions about our future. I trusted him completely. The admission opened a floodgate of understanding. Margaret's financial struggles hadn't been the result of poor planning or excessive spending. They'd been the result of trusting the wrong person with money that was supposed to secure our future. He stole from you. Not stole. Lost. Bad investments, he said. Market volatility. He showed me charts and graphs and explanations that sounded reasonable until there was nothing left. How much? Everything, Annabelle. The life insurance, Your father's business assets, even some of our savings that I'd given him access to. By the time I realized what was happening, it was all gone. The scope of the betrayal was staggering. Richard hadn't just mismanaged their money. He'd systematically drained every asset my father had worked to accumulate, leaving Margaret with nothing but debt and the desperate need to maintain appearances. Why didn't you tell me? What was I supposed to say? That I'd been so stupid, so trusting, that I'd let your father's best friend steal everything he'd worked for? That the reason we were struggling wasn't because life was hard, but because I'd made the worst possible decisions about protecting what he'd left us? I understood then why Margaret had reacted so strongly to my financial success. It wasn't just about control or jealousy. It was about shame. Crushing, overwhelming shame at having failed so completely to protect her family's legacy. But the trust money, I said. Richard didn't know about that. Apparently not. Your father kept it completely separate, managed through different lawyers, different banks. He must have known. She trailed off, the implications too painful to voice. Known that Richard couldn't be trusted. Margaret nodded, tears streaming down her face for the first time since Dad's funeral. I think your father suspected something was wrong with the business. Richard had been pushing for changes, wanting access to accounts he'd never needed before. David started keeping more things to himself, being more secretive about financial planning. The timeline was becoming clearer and more disturbing. Dad discovers that his business partner is potentially embezzling funds. He quietly establishes a secret trust to protect my future, using insurance policies that Richard doesn't know about. 2 weeks later, he's dead in a suspicious accident that benefits no one except the man who now has unfettered access to the family's remaining assets. Mom, I said carefully, do you think Richard had something to do with Dad's death? The question hung in the air like a live wire, dangerous and impossible to ignore. Margaret looked at me for a long moment, and I saw in her eyes the same suspicion that had been growing in my mind. I don't know, she whispered, but I've been wondering about it for 3 years. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my father's face the morning he died, distracted, worried about something he couldn't or wouldn't share. I'd been so focused on getting to school on time that I hadn't pressed him about what was bothering him. Now that oversight felt like a failure that had echoed through the past 3 years of our lives. At 2 a.m., I gave up on sleep and went to my computer. If Richard Morrison had been embezzling from my father's business, there would be traces, financial records, business filings, something that would show where the money had really gone. Morrison and Williams Consulting had been dissolved 6 months after my father's death. Quick, quiet, with Richard claiming that without his partner, the business wasn't viable. But dissolution records were public information, and I had the kind of resources now that made deep research possible. What I found made my blood run cold. The business hadn't been dissolved because it was failing. It had been dissolved because it was too successful, generating the kind of revenue that would have made both partners wealthy beyond their original dreams. Revenue that should have translated into assets for Dad's estate, but had somehow vanished into a maze of shell companies and offshore accounts. Richard hadn't just stolen from my mother after Dad died. He'd been systematically looting the business for at least 2 years before the accident, using a sophisticated network of fake vendors and inflated contracts to redirect money into accounts he controlled. And Dad had figured it out. I found the smoking gun buried in a file of email backups that had been submitted as part of the dissolution paperwork. Messages between my father and a forensic accountant, dated just 3 weeks before the accident. * David. The preliminary analysis confirms your suspicions. Approximately $2.3 million has been diverted through the channels we discussed. I strongly recommend contacting law enforcement before confronting your partner. This level of embezzlement typically involves additional crimes to cover the original theft. Dad had written back, *, I need more concrete evidence before I destroy a 20-year friendship. Richard has been like a brother to me. There has to be an explanation. The accountant's response was prophetic. *, David, men who steal millions don't stop at theft when their crimes are discovered. Please be careful. The email was dated 5 days before the accident. I printed everything and crept downstairs to wake Margaret. She was on the couch in the living room, still wearing yesterday's clothes, surrounded by more boxes of Dad's papers. She'd been going through them all night, probably looking for the same answers I'd just found. Mom, I whispered, shaking her gently. I found something. She sat up immediately, alert in the way that grief had trained her to be, always ready for the next crisis, the next revelation. The next piece of bad news that would reshape everything she thought she understood about her life. I showed her the emails, watching her face change as she read through the evidence of Richard's betrayal. Anger, hurt, and finally a terrible understanding of how completely they'd been manipulated. "He killed him," she said flatly. "Richard killed your father. We don't know that for sure." "Yes, we do." She stood up, pacing to the window that overlooked our backyard. "David was the most careful driver I knew. Never speeded, never took risks, always wore his seatbelt. The idea that he just lost control on a road he'd driven 1,000 times. It never made sense, but knowing something and proving it were different things entirely. The police had investigated the accident thoroughly, found no evidence of foul play, no mechanical problems with the car, no reason to suspect anything other than tragic circumstances. "What do we do?" I asked. Margaret turned back to me, and I saw something in her expression I hadn't seen since before Dad died. Determination. Purpose. The look of a woman who'd finally found a fight worth having. "We destroy him," she said simply. "The way he destroyed us." "Mom, we can't just..." "Can't what? Can't seek justice for your father's murder? Can't try to recover the money he stole? Can't expose a man who's probably done this to other people?" She was right, but the implications were staggering. Going after Richard would mean acknowledging that Dad's death hadn't been an accident. It would mean reopening wounds that had barely begun to heal, dragging our family through investigations and legal proceedings that could take years to resolve. "What if we're wrong?" I asked. "What if it really was just an accident, and Richard just made bad investments with the insurance money?" Margaret held up the printed emails. "Then why didn't he mention that your father suspected him of embezzlement? When he was helping me deal with the estate, when he was asking for access to accounts and assets, why didn't he say, 'By the way, David thought I was stealing from the business, but I can explain everything'? Because a man who was truly innocent would have mentioned it immediately. He would have provided documentation, explanations, evidence that the suspicious transfers had legitimate purposes. He wouldn't have let a grieving widow make financial decisions based on incomplete information." "There's something else," I said, remembering a detail from the trust documents I'd found. The trust wasn't just funded by Dad's life insurance. There were contributions from other sources, business accounts that Richard should have had access to. If he'd known about those accounts, the money would be gone too. So your father hid assets from his own business partner, which means he knew Richard couldn't be trusted long before he hired that forensic accountant. We sat in silence, both of us processing the scope of what we'd discovered. Richard Morrison hadn't just been a thief, he'd been a predator, systematically targeting his closest friend and business partner, stealing not just money, but trust, security, and ultimately a life. And he'd gotten away with it for 3 years. "Annabelle," Margaret said quietly, "I need you to know something. The money I took from your account yesterday, I used it to pay Richard." The confession hit like a physical blow. "What?" "He called Monday night, said there were still some outstanding debts from the business dissolution, legal fees that needed to be covered. He said if I didn't pay them, there could be complications with your father's estate." "And you believed him?" I was scared. "I've been behind on the mortgage for 2 months. The credit card companies are calling constantly, and I didn't know how to tell you how bad things had gotten. When Richard offered a solution, even an expensive one, I took it. The manipulation was breathtaking. Richard had not only stolen everything my father had worked for, but he was continuing to extract money from our family years later, using fear and guilt as weapons against a woman who'd trusted him completely." "How much have you paid him over the years?" "I don't know. Thousands. Maybe tens of thousands. Every few months there was another bill, another fee, another urgent payment that had to be made to protect the estate. And Margaret had paid everyone, borrowing against the house, maxing out credit cards, sacrificing her own financial security to protect a legacy that had already been stolen. "Mom," I said, "we're going to need help with this. Professional help." "What kind of help?" "The kind that investigates financial crimes and doesn't worry about the statute of limitations on murder." Margaret nodded, finally understanding what I was suggesting. We weren't just going to expose Richard's theft. We were going to prove that he'd killed my father to cover it up, and we were going to use my mysteriously acquired fortune to do it. The private investigator came recommended by Fletcher, though the lawyer had been careful to emphasize that our meeting was entirely off the record. Sarah Chen, no relation to Mrs. Chen from the bookstore, just one of those coincidences that made Seattle feel smaller than it was, had spent 15 years with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit before going private. She sat across from us in our living room, spreading documents across the coffee table with the methodical precision of someone who'd spent years building cases that sent people to federal prison. Tall, sharp-eyed, wearing the kind of understated expensive clothing that suggested she was very good at what she did. "This is substantial," she said, after reviewing everything we'd found. "Embezzlement, fraud, potential murder. But building a case that will hold up in court is going to require more than what you've shown me." "What else do you need?" Margaret asked. "Access to Richard's current financial records, bank statements, investment accounts, property purchases, anything that shows where your husband's money actually went. $3.5 million doesn't just disappear. It gets spent, invested, or hidden. That's where my resources became useful." While Margaret couldn't afford the kind of investigation that would be necessary to trace Richard's financial activities, I could. The trust that Dad had established to protect my future would now be used to expose the man who'd destroyed his life. "How long will it take?" I asked. "Depends on how careful he's been about covering his tracks. If he's smart, he'll have layered the money through multiple jurisdictions, offshore accounts, shell companies. If he's arrogant, he'll have bought toys, houses, cars, boats that we can trace directly back to the stolen funds." Sarah's preliminary research suggested that Richard fell into the arrogant category. 6 months after Dad's death, he'd purchased a $800,000 house in Bellevue. 2 months after that, a vintage Porsche that had cost more than most people made in a year. The following year, a cabin in the San Juan Islands and a yacht that he'd named Second Chances. "He's not even trying to hide it," Margaret said, staring at the photos Sarah had pulled from public records and social media. "That's the money he stole from us, and he's flaunting it. Men who commit financial crimes often can't resist showing off their success," Sarah explained. "The theft isn't just about money. It's about proving they're smarter than everyone around them. Richard probably gets a thrill from having people admire his lifestyle, knowing they don't realize it's built on betraying his best friend. But Richard's arrogance would be his downfall. Every purchase he'd made with Dad's money created a paper trail, and paper trails were exactly what Sarah specialized in following. "There's something else," she said, pulling out a file I hadn't seen before. "I did some preliminary research into your father's accident." The police investigation was thorough, but they were looking for evidence of mechanical failure or driver error. They weren't looking for murder. She spread out photos of the accident scene, diagrams showing the trajectory of Dad's car, and witness statements from people who'd arrived shortly after the crash. Looking at it through the lens of potential homicide, details that had seemed irrelevant suddenly became significant. "The impact pattern suggests your father was traveling much faster than the speed limit when he left the road," Sarah said. "But according to witnesses, he was a cautious driver. And there's this." She pointed to a detail in one of the police photos. Skid marks on the asphalt that showed Dad had tried to brake before the curve. "These marks start about 50 feet before the guardrail. If your father was driving recklessly or had fallen asleep, he wouldn't have had time to react. But if something else caused him to accelerate suddenly, like being pushed or run off the road, the braking pattern makes perfect sense." "Could you prove that?" Margaret asked. "Maybe. It would require reopening the case, bringing in accident reconstruction specialists, possibly exhuming the body for a more thorough autopsy. It's expensive, time-consuming, and there's no guarantee of success." "Do it," I said immediately. Both women looked at me in surprise. "All of it. Whatever it costs, however long it takes. My father deserves justice, and Richard Morrison deserves to pay for what he did." Sarah named a figure that would have been impossible for us to afford 6 months earlier. Retainer fees, expert witnesses, forensic accounting, accident reconstruction. The investigation would cost more than Margaret made in 3 years. "Are you sure?" Margaret asked quietly. "This is your money, Annabelle. Your future." But she was wrong. The money wasn't my future. It was Dad's legacy. He'd worked to provide for us, planned for our security, died trying to protect what he'd built. Using that legacy to expose his killer wasn't a sacrifice. It was exactly what the money was meant for. "There's one more thing," Sarah said as we were finishing up. "If we're right about this, if Richard did kill your father to cover up the embezzlement, then he knows about the trust." "What do you mean?" "Think about it. He's been systematically extracting money from your mother for 3 years, using fake debts and fabricated legal fees, but he's never approached you directly, never tried to get access to the trust funds. Either he doesn't know they exist, or he's waiting for something," I finished. Sarah nodded. The trust documents you found specify that the funding source would be revealed under certain conditions: marriage, children, reaching 25, or the death of an immediate family member. If Richard killed your father, he might be planning to eliminate other obstacles to accessing that money. The implication sent ice through my veins. If Richard was willing to kill once to cover his crimes, he might be willing to kill again to profit from them. You think we're in danger? I think you should be very careful about who you trust and where you go alone. Men who commit murder for money don't suddenly develop consciences about killing. As Sarah packed up her files and prepared to leave, Margaret walked her to the door while I stayed in the living room, staring at the evidence we'd assembled. 3 years of lies, manipulation, and theft, all leading to the death of the most important person in my life. But now, we had resources. We had evidence, and we had a plan. Richard Morrison had stolen my father's money, murdered my father, and spent 3 years torturing my mother with financial manipulation. It was time to return the favor. "Annabelle," Margaret said, coming back into the living room, "there's something else I need to tell you. Something I should have mentioned earlier." I looked up at her, wondering what other secrets our family had been keeping. "Richard called this morning. While you were meeting with the lawyer yesterday, he wants to have dinner with us next week. Says it's time we discussed your father's remaining assets and how they should be handled now that you're an adult." The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. The day after I'd visited Fletcher's office asking questions about the trust, Richard suddenly wanted to discuss Dad's assets. Either he'd been monitoring our activities, or someone at the law firm had told him about my visit. "What did you tell him?" I said yes. I thought it might be useful to hear what he has to say, especially now that we know what he's really done. Margaret was right. A dinner meeting would give us the chance to observe Richard, maybe even record his admissions about the missing money. But it would also put us in the same room as a man we now believed was a killer. "We'll do it," I said. "But we're going to be very, very careful about how we handle it." Because if Richard Morrison thought he was meeting with the same naive family he'd been manipulating for 3 years, he was about to learn how wrong he could be. The restaurant Richard had chosen was expensive in the way that rich men selected when they wanted to demonstrate their success. White tablecloths, servers who spoke in whispers, the kind of place where the absence of prices on the menu was supposed to convey exclusivity rather than pretension. Fleming's Prime Steakhouse in downtown Seattle, with a view of the Sound that had probably cost him as much as Margaret's monthly mortgage payment. He was waiting for us at a corner table, looking every inch the successful businessman in his tailored suit and confident smile. At 52, Richard Morrison had aged well, his gray hair lending him an air of distinguished authority that probably served him well in whatever new ventures had replaced the consulting firm he'd dissolved after murdering his partner. "Margaret, Annabelle," he said, standing to embrace my mother with the same warmth he'd shown at Dad's funeral. "You both look wonderful." I wondered if he practiced that sincerity in front of a mirror, perfecting the performance of caring about the family he'd destroyed. Margaret returned his hug with the same coldness she'd shown everyone since Dad's death, but Richard seemed not to notice. "It's been too long," he continued, settling back into his chair. "Though I understand congratulations are in order, Annabelle. I hear you've come into some money." The comment was casual, thrown away like an afterthought, but it confirmed what Sarah had suspected. Richard knew about the trust. The question was how much he knew, and what he intended to do about it. "Just some investments that worked out," I said carefully. "Investments?" His eyebrows raised in mock surprise. "A 19-year-old with successful investments? That's quite impressive. Your father would be proud." The mention of Dad felt like a slap, but I kept my expression neutral. Under the table, my phone was recording everything, feeding audio to Sarah Chen, who was monitoring from her car in the parking lot. "David always said Annabelle had a head for numbers," Margaret said, playing her role perfectly. We'd rehearsed this conversation, anticipating Richard's questions and preparing responses that would encourage him to reveal more than he intended. Yes, he did mention that. In fact, he mentioned a lot of things about planning for Annabelle's future in those last few weeks before the accident. He seemed quite focused on ensuring she'd be financially secure. Richard's smile never wavered, but there was something predatory in his eyes now, like a hunter who'd spotted prey and was preparing to strike. "It's funny how things work out," he continued. "David spends years worrying about providing for his family, and then tragedy strikes. But somehow, mysteriously, Annabelle ends up with substantial resources anyway, almost like David had a crystal ball." "What are you suggesting?" Margaret asked. "Oh, nothing sinister. Just that David was always more clever about financial planning than he let on. Take the business, for example. On paper, it looked like we had significant debts when he died. Legal obligations, outstanding contracts, vendor payments that had to be made. But I've always wondered if David had hidden assets somewhere, resources that never made it into the estate probate. The accusation was wrapped in reasonable language, but the implication was clear. Richard thought Dad had been hiding money from the business, and he wanted to know where it was. All of David's assets went through probate, Margaret said. You helped me with that process. Yes, I did. And it always struck me as odd how little there was, considering how successful our firm had become. David was meticulous about documentation, but there were accounts and investments that seemed to disappear right around the time of his death. Richard was fishing, trying to get us to admit knowledge of the trust, while positioning himself as the victim of Dad's financial secrecy. But he was also revealing more about his own activities than he probably realized. Maybe the accounts you're thinking of never existed, I suggested. Maybe someone was skimming money from the business and David found out about it. The temperature at the table dropped 10 degrees. Richard's smile remained, but his eyes went cold in a way that made my skin crawl. That's a serious accusation, Annabelle. Are you suggesting your father suspected embezzlement? I'm not suggesting anything. I'm just saying that if money disappeared from the business, there are only so many explanations for where it could have gone. Richard leaned back in his chair, studying both of us with the focused attention of a man reassessing his strategy. The friendly facade was beginning to crack, revealing something harder and more dangerous underneath. You know, he said slowly, I've been very patient with your family over the years, very understanding about the financial difficulties, very helpful with managing David's remaining obligations. But patience has its limits. What obligations? Margaret asked. The ones that don't go away just because someone dies. Business debts, legal commitments, partnership agreements that remain binding on the estate. David owed certain people money when he died, and those debts became your responsibility. It was all lies, of course. We knew now that the debts Richard had been collecting were fabricated, designed to extract as much money as possible from a grieving widow who trusted his expertise. But hearing him defend the deception so smoothly was chilling. What if we told you we don't believe those debts are legitimate? I asked. Richard's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture. He sat forward slightly, his hands clasped on the table in front of him. Then I'd say you're calling me a liar. And I'd have to ask myself why David Williams' daughter would make such an accusation against the man who's been protecting her family's interests for 3 years. Maybe because we hired a forensic accountant to review Dad's business records. Maybe because we found evidence that millions of dollars were stolen from Morrison and Williams Consulting in the 2 years before Dad died. The words hung in the air like a grenade with the pin pulled. Richard went perfectly still, his carefully maintained composure finally cracking to reveal the cold calculation underneath. That's impossible, he said quietly. Is it? Because we have bank records, email correspondence, documentation of shell companies and fake vendor accounts. We know exactly how much you stole, when you stole it, and how you tried to cover it up. Margaret reached into her purse and pulled out a folder containing copies of the evidence Sarah had assembled. She placed it on the table between them, watching Richard's face as he recognized documents he'd probably hoped were destroyed years ago. We also know that Dad discovered what you were doing, I continued, that he hired investigators and was planning to turn evidence over to the police, right up until he died in a very convenient accident. Richard looked from the folder to us, and for the first time since I'd known him, his mask slipped completely. What I saw underneath was terrifying. Not guilt or remorse, but cold fury at being outmaneuvered. You have no idea what you're playing with, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Then explain it to us, Margaret said. Explain how my husband's best friend stole everything he worked for, murdered him to cover it up, and then spent 3 years psychologically torturing his widow. Richard was quiet for a long moment, studying us both with the focused attention of a predator calculating odds. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, measured, and absolutely terrifying. David wasn't as smart as he thought he was. He found some discrepancies, yes, started asking questions, making accusations, but he made the mistake of confronting me directly instead of going to the authorities. He thought our friendship meant something. The confession was casual, matter of fact, like he was discussing the weather instead of admitting to embezzlement and murder. So you killed him, I said. I protected myself. David was going to destroy everything I'd worked for over a few $1 million that he didn't even need. His family was comfortable. His daughter would be fine. But he was willing to send me to prison over money that was just sitting in business accounts earning minimal interest. The justification was breathtaking in its narcissism. Richard had convinced himself that stealing was acceptable because the money wasn't being used aggressively enough for his liking. And the accident was easier than I expected. David always took the same route home from the office. Secluded road, steep embankment, no witnesses. A little nudge from another vehicle at exactly the right moment. And suddenly it looked like he lost control on a wet curve. Margaret was crying now, silent tears streaming down her face, as she listened to the man she'd trusted describe murdering her husband with the same casual tone he might use to order dinner. "You're confessing to murder," I said. Richard smiled, and I realized he'd been recording our conversation too. "Actually, I'm telling a story to two people who have no evidence, no witnesses, and no credibility. David Williams died in a single car accident 3 years ago. The police investigated thoroughly and found no evidence of foul play. Case closed." He reached across the table and picked up the folder Margaret had placed there, slipping it into his briefcase with practiced ease. "These documents, on the other hand, represent a clear case of harassment and defamation. Accusations made by a financially desperate woman and her daughter, who've somehow acquired resources of questionable legality. I imagine a prosecutor would be very interested in understanding exactly how a 19-year-old girl obtained access to millions of dollars." The threat was clear. Richard was prepared to use the trust against me, to paint our investigation as somehow criminal, while positioning himself as the victim of our accusations. "You're not going to get away with this," Margaret said. "I already have gotten away with it. For 3 years. And I'll continue to get away with it as long as you remember that you have much more to lose than I do." Richard stood up, straightening his jacket with the same careful attention to appearance that had defined his performance throughout dinner. "Enjoy your meal, ladies. And remember, David's dead, the money's gone, and nothing you do is going to change either of those facts." He walked away without looking back, leaving us alone with the wreckage of everything we'd thought we understood about justice, family, and the price of revenge. But Richard Morrison had made one critical mistake. He'd assumed that because he'd gotten away with murder once, he was untouchable. He was about to learn how wrong he could be. 3 months later, I stood in the hallway outside courtroom 7B in the King County Superior Court, watching Richard Morrison's defense attorney argue with prosecutors about plea agreements and sentencing recommendations. Through the glass doors, I could see Richard himself, sitting at the defendant's table in an orange jumpsuit that was a far cry from the expensive suits he'd worn to steal millions of dollars and murder my father. Sarah Chen had been right about paper trails. When you steal that much money, when you murder someone to cover it up, when you spend years manipulating the victim's family for additional profit, you leave traces that forensic accountants can follow like breadcrumbs through a dark forest. The yacht named Second Chances had been purchased with funds traced directly to Morrison and Williams' consulting accounts. The Bellevue house, the vintage Porsche, the cabin in the San Juan Islands, all of it bought with money that should have been part of Dad's estate. Richard's arrogance had created a paper trail so clear that even his expensive lawyers couldn't explain it away. But the financial crimes were only part of the story. The accident reconstruction had been more difficult, requiring exhumation of Dad's body for a more thorough autopsy and analysis of evidence that had been sitting in storage for 3 years. What the specialists found was subtle but definitive. Paint transfer on Dad's car that didn't match the guardrail he'd struck, impact patterns consistent with being struck by another vehicle, and tissue samples that showed he'd been unconscious when the car left the road. Richard had been more violent than even we'd suspected. He hadn't just run Dad off the road, he'd struck him in the head first, probably with a tire iron or similar weapon, then staged the accident to cover up what was clearly premeditated murder. "Miss Williams?" I turned to see Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Walsh approaching, carrying the same briefcase that had held months of evidence, testimony, and legal maneuvering that had brought us to this moment. "The defense just accepted our offer," she said. "Life without parole for first-degree murder. Consecutive 20-year sentences for embezzlement and fraud. He'll die in prison." The news should have felt like victory, but mostly I just felt tired. 3 months of depositions, hearings, media attention, and legal proceedings had drained something from me that I wasn't sure would ever recover. Justice was important, but it didn't bring Dad back. It didn't erase 3 years of Margaret's suffering, or the knowledge that our family had been systematically destroyed by someone we'd trusted. "What about restitution?" I asked. "The court will order full restitution for the embezzled funds, plus interest and penalties. We've frozen his assets, seized the properties, liquidated the investments. Your mother should recover most of what was stolen, though the legal fees will reduce the final amount. Margaret emerged from the courtroom, looking older than her 43 years, but somehow lighter than she'd appeared in months. The weight of secrets, shame, and financial desperation was finally lifting from her shoulders. "Is it over?" she asked. "It's over," Walsh confirmed. "Richard Morrison will spend the rest of his life in prison, and you'll get back most of the money he stole." Most of the money. Not all of it, because legal fees and asset liquidation costs meant that even perfect justice came at a price, but enough to pay off the house, clear the credit cards, and give Margaret the financial security that Dad had worked so hard to provide. We walked out of the courthouse together, past the reporters who'd been covering the case, and into the Seattle afternoon that felt different somehow. Cleaner, like a storm had finally passed and left the air fresh and breathable. "Annabelle," Margaret said as we reached her car, "there's something I need to say to you. Something I should have said months ago." I waited, watching her choose words carefully for a conversation we'd both been avoiding since that day at the mall when everything changed. "I'm sorry. For the way I treated you. For the things I said. For not trusting you when you tried to help. You were stronger and smarter and more capable than I ever gave you credit for, and I nearly destroyed our relationship because I couldn't accept that." The apology was complete, honest, and long overdue, but it also opened a door to conversations we'd been avoiding about the future, about money, about what our relationship would look like now that the crisis had passed. "I'm sorry too," I said. "I should have told you about the trust from the beginning. I should have found a way to help without keeping secrets. You were 19 years old, dealing with more responsibility than most adults could handle, and you used your resources to get justice for your father and recovery for our family. I don't know how to thank you for that. But gratitude wasn't what I wanted from Margaret. What I wanted was harder to define. A relationship built on honesty rather than secrets, respect rather than control, trust rather than manipulation. "I've been thinking," I said carefully, "about what comes next. For both of us." Margaret nodded. Clearly,